The people of Austin, Texas have experienced difficulty recently, if you've been following the news. Though the authorities have identified the bomber, and the bomber is dead, the why or the cause for such a person to do what he did might never be answered. We, and by that I mean humanity at large, we like to find the patterns and the reasons that exist behind the events of life, especially if those events impact us greatly. And some in Austin have been impacted dramatically by this bomber. One of the bomber's former neighbors is quoted as saying that he was extremely surprised that this particular neighbor of his was the bomber. People close to the matter, and many in the states who are not close will follow it. People close will be wondering what drove this man to do the things that he did. And those answers might never be found conclusively. I checked this morning, and even as recently as last night, more was posted on this story, and apparently there was some recording that was left, but still there are questions that are not answered. People are confused by senseless evil. We don't know the full motives. And senseless evil disturbs us in ways that understandable evil does not. We've already recognized in our study of the book of Job that Job himself does not know of God's conversations with Satan. We've been through one of those conversations already in the first chapter. From his perspective, from Job's perspective, he's ignorant about why he has lost everything. His children, his livestock, his servants. And this means it's important. It's really important that we keep this in mind as we try to understand Job as best we can. This means that he does not know God's verdict in Job 1:22. In all this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrong. God was watching. Now, he probably knew that theologically, but he had not heard any kind of affirmation from God. He doesn't know that he passed the initial test, nor does he know of the second conversation that we get to in chapter 2. And I want to be careful as we need to try to understand Job as well as we can, but there are certainly things that we do not get because we were not the ones experiencing it firsthand. That doesn't mean that we don't try to understand Job, that just means that we need to be cautious as we try to put ourselves in his shoes. So at this point, let's look to Job chapter 2, and I'm going to read verses 1 through 10, our passage this morning. Again, there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them to present himself before the Lord. And the Lord said to Satan, "From where have you come?" Satan answered the Lord and said, "From going to and fro on the earth, and from walking up and down on it." The Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, who fears God and turns away from evil? He still holds fast his integrity, although you incited against him to destroy him without reason." Then Satan answered the Lord and said, "Skin for skin. All that a man has he will give for his life. But stretch out your hand and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will curse you to your face." And the Lord answered Satan, and the Lord said to Satan, "Behold, he is in your hand. Only spare his life." So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and struck Job with loathsome sores from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. And he took a piece of broken pottery with which to scrape himself while he sat in the ashes. Then his wife said to him, "Do you still hold fast your integrity? Curse God and die." But he said to her, "You speak as one of the foolish women would speak. Shall we receive good from God? And shall we not receive evil?" In all this, Job did not sin with his lips. Our theme this morning is not an exciting theme. It's not necessarily even an encouraging theme. But it's a necessary teaching from Scripture. Sometimes we must receive unexplained evil from God. Sometimes we must receive unexplained evil from God. It's not an easy truth for us to accept, let alone to grasp. But I believe that it's what the text shows about God's actions and his servant Job. In fact, this is what he points his wife to as he answers her in verse 10. Though we might go through events that don't make sense to us, we can see what happened in and around Job's life and we can learn. So how is it okay that we sometimes receive unexplained evil from God? Well, I think that this study, this passage can help. Because we can, as we study, we can look to our own lives and speak the truth about God to our own hearts. We can speak the truth that we find from passages like this to our own hearts and to the hearts of our brothers and sisters in Christ. Job didn't know why life became worse for him after he lost his possessions and children. He didn't know. But we can learn from him. Let's see how life became worse for him, how the evil came about in his life. And in doing that, I think that can help us in our own lives. So as we go through these 10 verses, we're going to have 3 different sections. The first section is God recognizes Job's integrity. That's in the first 3 verses. And then Satan presses his attack in verses 4 through 7. In verses 8 through 10, we'll see Job continues to endure. God does recognize Job's integrity. At the very beginning, as we start looking at this passage, we need to remember and keep in mind because it's crucial. Verses 1 through 7. We see those verses. Job did not. He didn't see it. And so even as these pieces are coming together for us, these are huge things that are missing in Job's mind. I don't think we can emphasize that enough. It's important for us to keep coming back to that. You can probably guess what I'm going to say about your life in this regard. There's more to the story of your life and the lives of those you love than you know. And maybe that's very little help. Because all I'm saying is there's more there. I don't know what it is. I don't know how God is making sense of what he's doing in your life and in the lives of those around you that are close to you. But I do know there's more. What it comes down to is knowing that there's more of the story that God has not given to you. What it comes down to is your knowledge of God and your trust in him. Now, you could reject the truth that there's more to your life that's going on that you don't understand. You could reject that and say, well, there's no true meaning in life. It's just what I see and observe. Or you could reject that God knows what's going on and is working to accomplish his plan. We don't want to go in either one of those directions. There is meaning in life. And God does know what's going on and is accomplishing his will through you and in you. So we don't want to go to those false options. And I hope quite deeply that our study of Job helps us to see the utter and complete necessity of trusting in our faithful God. Now back to verses 1 to 3. It's really, much of these verses are repeating what we already saw in Job chapter 1, verses 6 through 8. A very similar beginning to this scene in the throne room of God. But there are some notable differences. So back in chapter 1, verse 6, now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. We see that in chapter 2, verse 1. With the addition of, at the end of that verse, Satan also came among them to present himself before the Lord. So the sons of God or the angels are coming in to give their reports to God. Satan is among them. And here it clearly says in chapter 2 that he's going to present himself before the Lord as well. And this is a small point, but I think it's important. Even Satan is accountable to God. He had a mission that he had received from God, and he's coming back to report it. It can be easy to just think, well, Satan's doing his own thing. He's an enemy of God. He just does whatever he wants. Well, remember, God has prepared the lake of fire for Satan. Satan will answer fully to God for what he has done throughout his existence. And here we see in Job 2, he's coming to give a report, to present himself before the Lord. Once again, God asks Satan where he's been, and Satan gives his vague answer, oh, here and there. And then God asks whether Satan has considered his servant Job. And he gives this fourfold description that we've been over several times. Blameless and upright. He fears God and he turns away from evil. There's none like him on the earth. This is a unique man. But then he adds more. Here's another difference between Job 1 and Job 2. The first throne room scene and the second. Then God says, he still holds fast his integrity, though you incited me against him to destroy him without reason. There's some very encouraging things about that statement, and some very confusing things about that statement. It's important that we go through this one carefully. We're happy to see that Job is still a man of integrity. He's exactly the kind of man that God had said he was. Now, if you want an interesting study, because I'm not going to delve into all of it this morning, there are 4 passages where this word integrity is used. Four occurrences in the book. The one is in chapter 2, verse 3 here. The second one is just a few verses later, down in verse 9. So God recognizes Job is holding to his integrity. His wife says in verse 9, totally unaware of God's verdict, she says, do you still hold fast to your integrity? So there's the second occurrence. All the way later in chapter 27, verse 5, and then 31:6, Job uses this word of himself in 2 important passages. And so I'm holding back to further study until we get to that part of Job. But Job believed he was a man of integrity. His wife believed he was a man of integrity. And God said he was a man of integrity. But God is silent through much of the book. And as his friends are convinced of his guilt before God, not of his integrity, Job really yearns quite deeply for confirmation and explanation from God. But what if he would have heard God say this at the very beginning? What would have changed? Well, we wouldn't have much of the book. Job could have just gone to his friends and said, it doesn't matter what you think. I know what God's opinion is on this. But he didn't know. So all of that would have been cut out. And much more than that, Job would not have grown in the ways that he was forced to grow during the book. He did grow. There was a progression for Job. But there was also this time of silence from God, not knowing where he stood. It's important, believer, to know that as you experience life, God knows your heart. He knows your motivations. He knows everything about you. Life might not make sense, and probably in some ways it will never make sense. You're still responsible for living rightly before God. God is fully aware of what you're doing for the sake of his name. So don't lose heart. You don't see the whole story, but God sees everything about you. In the realm of suffering, it's very hard to cling to the truth of God's justice. How is evil taking place? Why is he allowing this to continue? There are certain things that we must cling to about the character of God. And here we see God knows fully what Job is doing. God is seeing that Job is passing this test. Job does not hear that verdict yet. As a side note, if you want to do that study on integrity in Job, go then to Romans 3. And we just have tremendous revelation from God in the New Testament that shows us. We don't need to be in any doubt of God's view of us as believers. Just tremendous gifts that God's given us in his word about how he looks at us. Ephesians 1 is another wonderful passage. Those who are in Christ. But that's a whole other thing you can go to on your own sometime. The final significant difference in verses 1 through 3 is at the end of verse 3. Although you incited me against him to destroy him without reason. And to understand this phrase properly, we need to return to what Satan said to God in the first heavenly scene. So look at chapter 1, verse 9. Satan answered the Lord and said, "Does Job fear God for no reason?" So as God says this now in chapter 2, verse 3, without reason, there's a connection there. Satan claimed that Job feared God because of the blessing that he enjoyed from God's hand. So when God says in this passage, chapter 2, verse 3, that his actions against Job were for no reason, he is saying that Satan had failed. Putting Job through the first test revealed nothing new about Job. So Satan's accusation against Job's motivation had no basis. The test was without reason. Though God had his own reasons for doing what he does towards Job, his statement here is meant to highlight the fact that Satan's accusation against God's servant was hollow. Satan had been completely wrong. In a culture where accusations can destroy a person's reputation, whether those accusations are well-founded or not, I think we can understand what God is saying to Satan. In essence, it was something like this. You thought he needed to be checked out to make sure he is truly what he looks like. Well, we put him through the ringer and he came through squeaky clean. You were wrong. There's nothing here to uncover. That's God's message to Satan in verse 3. Now, maybe the wording causes us to wonder if God is showing himself to be swayed by Satan here. When he says, "You incited me. You pushed me towards this." But this can't be the implication. God is showing his superiority to Satan by proving him wrong, even as he allows the very test that Satan wanted Job to experience. God knew Satan was wrong. But Satan thought, well, let me have it. Let me push him to the end. He'll crack. To drive this point home even further, we'll see that God permits Satan to go further in the evil that he brings against Job. And so this is where we get to the point where we see Satan pressing his attack. Refusing to be beaten, yet Satan urges God to let him go further. And the phrase skin for skin still is a bit confusing. I really can't give you hey, this is what it means. The safest interpretation, I think, in this passage is to look at the very next phrase. All that a man has, he will give for his life. Yeah, we took all of this away, but you know what? Job is still living. I couldn't even touch him. So he's willing to give that stuff up as long as he can keep on living. God, so let me add him again, but let me hurt him more deeply, more personally. Satan's words continue to the next verse as he urges God to go further in testing his servant with a reference once again to God's hand, a reference to the power and the control of God, from whom Satan must have permission if he's to afflict Job further. Remember in Job chapter 1 verse 12, we see that God had to give permission to Satan for him to harm anything that Job had to begin with. But God had said that he could not harm Job himself. Only against him do not stretch out your hand. But there is a way to intensify Job's sufferings. There is a way to take this test case of affliction against a man of integrity to a whole new level. There's a way to see this situation through, and that is to afflict Job to his very bones and flesh. By driving this suffering home, Satan will break God's servant and cause him to curse God in the end. At least that's what Satan accuses. So once again, we return to the ruthlessness, the hatred that Satan has for God's enemies. For God is, let me say that again. Once again, we come back to the ruthlessness and hatred that Satan, God's enemy, has for God's servants. It's not just against God that Satan is an enemy, it's also against those who follow God. And even as we remind ourselves about Satan's hatred towards God and towards God's people, we must also recognize that this is ultimately God's plan. Here's some things that are hard to put together, but important. Satan is merely a tool. It's dangerous tool, but he's a tool. After verse 7, he will pass from the scene of the book. He won't be back. The petri dish of Job's life was designed by God, and Satan is about to fulfill his role in this test case. God decided it was necessary for Job to experience yet another level of agony. But he decided this for very different reasons than what drives Satan to lash out against Job. God grants Satan his request, but he tells him to spare his life as well. It's an interesting word that he uses here at the end of verse 6. Behold, he's in your hand, only spare his life. That word spare, it's interesting because it has often the sense of watch over or preserve. Job must be alive if God and Satan are to witness how he reacts. So God charges Satan to take care of what he's about to do. But we still must come at the end of saying God handed Job over into Satan's hand. That reality is still there. The only qualification is that he must keep Job alive. So we can conclude that it's going to hurt Job. Probably in more than one way. Now, let's think about this further. What conclusions do we start to draw if bad things start happening to us? Or maybe a better question is, how do you respond when you think that the suffering has gone far enough, but it doesn't stop? It gets worse. As much as we hate to admit it, Satan does have a point in what he says. In some ways, the suffering that is in the world around us is different than the suffering that we experience mentally or physically or emotionally. Although we don't want suffering to get to that personal level, I think we recognize that sometimes it does. And when it does, it means something different than when the suffering is outside of us. I'm not saying that we don't care about what's going on around us, but it's different. You might see what Satan does in verse 7 and think that this is a bit anticlimactic. I mean, swords are bad, but is this really as bad as it's going to get? And yet we can gather from the rest of the book that Job's suffering from what Satan did was indeed very great. And I'm not saying this to minimize what verse 7 says. He has loathsome sores from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. None of us want that. But the rest of the book really gives witness to the terrible nature of what Satan did to Job. So you'll see some verses up there on the screen, and I might jump around from one to the next. But here's a description of what we get from the book about Job and his suffering. In just a few verses later, verse 12, Job's friends don't even recognize him when they see him from a distance. In chapter 7, verse 5, Job mentions worms, hardened skin, and unhealed sores. In 30:30, he mentions blackened, dead skin and says, my bones burn with heat. Job 16:16 says, my face is red with weeping, and on my eyelids is deep darkness. Job 30, verse 27 is probably a reference to him suffering diarrhea. He experiences sleeplessness, and when he did sleep, he had nightmares. Job 7, verses 4, 13, and 14. Job 19:17 says, my breath is strange to my wife, and I'm a stench to the children of my own mother. In Job 19:20, this verse contains a phrase you've probably heard before, but in different context. But it shows he's losing weight from his suffering. And it says, my bones stick to my skin and to my flesh, and I have escaped by the skin of my teeth. Job 30, verse 17 says, the night racks my bones, and the pain that gnaws me takes no rest. I think that gives us a fuller picture of what he experienced. And it was grisly. It was gory. It was disgusting. Suffice it to say, Job was being assaulted in multiple, unending ways. His life became an utter misery. And let's make sure we see that as the book describes him, his very appearance would have turned most people away. He would have looked and smelled repulsive. And this would only aid the thinking of his friends that God's hand was against him. How could God truly be looking on him in joy and grace if this is what he looks like? So how will Job respond? We see in verses 8 through 10 that Job continues to endure. The first reaction we see from him is very basic. He goes to the isolated place of the ash heap, a place that many in the ancient times would come to use for mourning. And he starts scraping his sores with a piece of broken pottery. To this point that we meet the one surviving member of his family, his immediate family, his wife. We haven't met her yet. And maybe with the flair for the dramatic, the narrator has not mentioned her until this point. And her counsel is quite different in some ways from Job's friends. They just go on and on and on. Her counsel is very brief. One question, two commands. Do you still hold fast your integrity? She's using the same word God did. She's using it with very different emphasis. Curse God and die. Now, wives, this is a painful thing, but I want you to consider how you would counsel your husbands if you saw them like this. It's hard even to comprehend such a question. Husbands, how would you counsel your wives? How would you counsel your parents or your children? Maybe those questions make you angry or indignant. I don't know what kind of response that generates in you. We don't even want to think about being in such a position. But I say these things for a very specific reason. She loved her husband and she didn't want him to have to endure. She remembered very clearly what life had been like only a little while ago. I don't know what kind of time frame we're looking at from when he lost everything to when this happens. But she knew what life had been like. She knew her husband to be a man of integrity. I think she loved him deeply, and I believe that these words show that. Not that her conclusion was right, but she did not want to see a man she so deeply respected and who had been so great fall so far. She's seeing before, in her very eyes, this man crumble. And yet he's still holding to something that she thinks, if he could just let go of that, this could end. Now, as much as we should try to understand his wife, we must not miss her mistake. Her response was so centered upon her husband that she placed Job's responsibility to God on a lesser plane than Job's welfare. She wanted Job to feel better and to look better, or let the misery be over. And that was more important to her. That was more important to her than his responsibility to God. Note how because she raised her husband's life above obedience to God and faith in him, she unwittingly offered what? What did she offer to Job? We've heard it already in the book. She offered to Job the very temptation that Satan was seeking to get across. She was wanting him to fail so that his pain would end. Here's the temptation from somebody very close to Job that is packaged to look reasonable and really the sensible thing to do. Curse God. What did Satan say? What is he after? See, he didn't go to Job and offer this himself. No, he took somebody that was close to Job. In fact, nobody would have been closer to Job than his wife. Believer, beware. When we exchange the glory of God for the glory of lesser things, when we exalt the creature above the Creator, we are serving an idol. Beyond this, we might very well be tempting others to do the same. We don't need more people who are driven to sinful actions for the sake of things or people that they love. We need more people who are driven to faithfulness to God, to endurance and suffering, because there's only one being who is supremely worthy of our love and sacrifice, who is supremely worthy of our worship. We need those who will endure. So in the end, the specific message regarding Job's wife is clear. Don't be like her. Don't let your love for a created thing or being become more important than your love for God, your devotion to Him. That is a difficult message to say, but it's a necessary. Right love is vital. In a remarkable show of grace on Job's part, a remarkable show of love and faith in God, he responds. And I really do think that he was careful and loving in his response. You might look at those words and think, ouch. He says, you speak as one of the foolish women would speak. Shall we receive good from God, and shall we not receive evil? But the first thing I'd say is, what he's not calling her directly a fool. What is he saying? You speak as one of the foolish women would speak. You can almost hear him thinking, and I know you're not one of them. This is not how you've been. No, that's not there. But he doesn't say to her, you are a fool. I would say that's another level of directness that he avoids. No, you speak as one of the foolish women would speak. His language is softer than it could have been. And yet he tells her a very important truth. His response still bites, but I think it's careful. I really do think that he's communicating. I don't know how it sounded, I don't know how it looked. And you know how when people are in pain, sometimes their words even come out in ways that they don't intend for them to come out. There's a lot that we don't know here. Now, why does he bring up this word foolish? Psalm 14:1 says, the fool says in his heart, there is no God. Fools, at least in thought, are atheists. They like to pretend that God does not exist, and therefore they like to pretend that they are not accountable to God. So why does he say, you speak as one of the foolish women would speak? Her advice is essentially atheistic. However you're accountable to God, that's less important than ending your misery. That's pragmatism. That's atheism. Practical atheism. So Job's response to her is to say that her counsel is indeed foolish, and he shows his strong belief in humanity's accountability to God through a question. I've already said it a couple times. Shall we receive good from God, and shall we not receive evil? Now this word evil is not referring to sin, but rather bad things. So he's saying, shall we not receive misery, or trouble, or calamity, or destruction, or disaster from God? We hear him say, well, I'd rather not. Let's keep that out of life. That's just not the testimony of Scripture. Two tremendous passages come to mind regarding teaching like this. One is Romans 8:28 through 39. We're not going to turn there. And the other is Hebrews 11. I would encourage you to turn to Hebrews 11. I think it's very important to show that what Job is experiencing here, and his answer to his wife of saying, shall we not receive evil from God, is an important truth to grasp for the believer even today. So turning over to Hebrews 11, I'd actually like to get a running start in chapter 10, verse 32. We're not going to read all of Hebrews 11. I'm going to do some skimming and some reading. But Hebrews 10:32. But recall the former days when, after you were enlightened, you endured a hard struggle with sufferings, sometimes being publicly exposed to reproach and affliction, and sometimes being partners with those so treated. For you had compassion on those in prison, and you joyfully accepted the plundering of your property, since you knew that you yourselves had a better possession and an abiding one. Therefore, do not throw away your confidence, which has a great reward, for you have need of endurance, so that when you have done the will of God, you may receive what is promised. For, and he quotes, yet a little while, the coming one will come and will not delay. But my righteous one shall live by faith. And if he shrinks back, my soul has no pleasure in him. But we are not of those who shrink back. and are destroyed, but of those who have faith and preserve their souls. Now, who are those who have faith and preserve their souls? They are those like Hebrews 11. So he is urging them, endure. There is suffering. You have a hard struggle. Endure. And then he points them back to examples from the past. By faith, Abel. By faith, Enoch. By faith, Noah. By faith, Abraham. By faith, Sarah. Then down in verse 13. These all died in faith. Now, I should be careful there. Enoch didn't die, but that's another story. Verse 13. They died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. For people who speak thus make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. If they had been thinking of that land from which they had gone out, they would have had opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. Therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared for them a city. What a statement. I love Hebrews 11. But God is not ashamed to be called their God. By faith, Abraham, as the text goes on, by faith Isaac, by faith Jacob, by faith Joseph, by faith Moses. Then we get down to verse 32. What more shall I say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, and Samuel, and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, were made strong out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. Women received back their dead by resurrection. We love that list. That's a list of glory. Amazing things. But it doesn't stop there. Some were tortured, refusing to accept release. Man, that sounds very similar to Job. So that they might rise again to a better life. Others suffered mocking and flogging, even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned. They were sawn in two. They were killed with the sword. They went about in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, afflicted, mistreated, of whom the world was not worthy. Wandering about in deserts and mountains and in dens and caves of the earth. There are so many things that you can set your sights on. Say, these things matter. But here are people in Hebrews 11 that are seeking a homeland. And that homeland is not on this earth. They're living by faith. All these, verse 39, though commended through their faith, did not receive what was promised. Their sight was partial, but their faith was there. And so, believer, as you have things in your life and you're saying, these things don't add up. I want to know more of the story. How is God still good? How is God still loving? How is God still just? How is God still all-powerful? God is forcing you. He's forcing you to live a life of faith. So why go to Hebrews 11? You're not alone. No, this has been the case for century after century after century after century, where God puts his people on the earth. He gives no promise of an easy life. But what do we have in common with these people? We look to Jesus. Well, did they know about Jesus? Well, they received what they knew, and they believed. As God had revealed himself, so they believed. As God has revealed himself today, so we believe. If there's any line of people that we should desire to fall in with, let it be this type. Those who live by faith. Life might not be great. It might be extremely painful, embarrassing, something we want out of. And yet in all of that, you have need of endurance, so that when you have done the will of God, you may receive what is promised. So Job is not alone in this. Maybe he's the extreme example, one who is pushed to his limit and far beyond it. He had to decide, do I believe in God? Do I cling to the truth about Him? Or do I turn from that? Especially when his wife is offering the temptation. So Job says, Job chapter 2, verse 10, in all of this, Job did not sin with his lips. He passes the second test, at least to this point. Proverbs 21:23 says, whoever keeps his mouth and his tongue keeps himself out of trouble. So he's passing the second extreme level of suffering, and we never hear from Satan again in this book of Job. How do we conclude from a passage like this? I point us to the example of Christ. Many years later, Jesus, though unlike Job in some ways because he knew what was coming and he understood the big picture, but he still expressed very similar thoughts to what Job said about receiving evil from God. So in Matthew 26, verses 36 to 39, then Jesus went with them to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, sit here, while I go up over there and pray. And taking with him Peter and the two sons of Zebedee, he began to be very sorrowful and troubled. Then he said to them, my soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch with me. And going a little farther, he fell on his face and he prayed, saying, my Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will. What does that express? He was ready to receive the evil from the Father's hand. Didn't want it, and he's praying desperately that that did not be necessary. But sometimes God's people must receive evil from his hand. And then we go over to Hebrews 5, 7, and 8. We close with this. In the days of his flesh, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death, and he was heard because of his reverence. Does that mean he didn't die? No. Although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered. And so, child of God, this morning, is God bringing you to a point where you need to learn obedience through what you suffer? It's a heavy task. Others before you have been called to it. Others after you will be called to it. It does not mean anything less about God. In fact, God desires to see you through all of that. And so I encourage you and invite you to join the ranks of those of whom the world was not worthy, because of God's great grace in their lives. Be those who are people of faith, clinging to the truth of who God is and what He is doing, even if there are things that we desperately want to know and never will in this life. Let's pray. God, thank you for the examples of others who have gone before us. We praise you for your work of grace in Job's life, that he would be such a man of integrity, that he would endure through this and not sin. We thank you for the example of Jesus Christ. Thank you that he learned obedience through what he suffered. Thank you for those who have lived before the life of Christ and since the life of Christ who have lived by faith, of whom the world was not worthy. Some you did magnificent things through it. Others you chose to have passed through times of deep agony and suffering, even to the point of losing their lives. So thank you for the people of the past that clung to you and lived by faith. Encourage us to go forward today and tomorrow and throughout the week and from here by faith. rejoicing in what we do know from your word, and trusting in you with what we don't know. And of course, we pray, if there are those who have not yet, turn to Jesus Christ as Savior, as the one who died in their place so that they can have life and forgiveness before you. Please turn them to you today. In Jesus' name we pray.